The dust from the cattle drive had barely settled when Eliza Thornton stepped onto the porch of the Silver Creek Ranch and felt her entire world shatter into pieces she could not name. She stood there in the fading light of the Arizona Territory evening in 1882, her hands trembling at her sides, her breath catching in her throat like a wild thing trying to escape. The letter she had received that morning was still clutched in her fist, the paper damp from her sweating palms, and she could not stop the tears that began to fall. She did not hear his boots on the wooden planks, did not know anyone was near until she felt the solid presence of someone standing beside her, close enough that she could smell the leather and sage and honest sweat of a man who had spent the day working under the relentless sun. She turned her head slightly and saw through her blurred vision the tall figure of Cole Bennett, the ranch foreman who had arrived at Silver Creek 6 months ago from Colorado. He did not speak. He did not ask what was wrong or try to force words from her trembling lips. He simply stood there, steady as the mountains that rose in the purple distance, and when her knees began to buckle beneath the weight of her grief, his arm came around her shoulders and guided her gently against his chest. The cotton of his work shirt was rough against her cheek, still warm from the day's heat, and she pressed her face into it and sobbed with an abandon she had never allowed herself before. His hand came up to rest against her hair, not stroking or patting, just holding her steady, and in that moment, something shifted in her heart that she would not fully understand until much later. Cole Bennett had learned long ago that some sorrows were too deep for words, that sometimes the kindest thing a man could do was simply be present in another person's pain. He had seen enough heartbreak in his 32 years to know that Eliza Thornton, the 24-year-old daughter of the ranch owner, was carrying something heavy and terrible, and he would not dishonor her grief by demanding explanations. He felt her body shake against his, heard the raw sound of her crying, and he kept his breathing steady and slow, an anchor in her storm. The sunset painted the sky in shades of copper and gold, and still she cried, and still he held her, and when at last her sobs began to quiet, he made no move to step away. She pulled back slightly, her face red and wet, her eyes swollen, and she looked up at him with such naked gratitude that it struck something deep in his chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse and broken. He nodded once, his blue eyes serious and kind, and then he stepped back to give her space. "You need anything, Miss Thornton, you just say the word." She shook her head, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, and he noticed the crumpled letter still gripped in her other fist. He did not look at it. He did not ask. He simply touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect and turned to go, his boots heavy on the porch steps as he descended into the gathering dusk. Eliza watched him walk toward the bunkhouse, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the last light of day, and she felt something warm and unexpected bloom in the cold hollow of her chest. She had known loss before, had buried her mother 3 years ago and watched her father retreat into silence and whiskey. But she had never known this particular kindness, this quiet understanding that asked for nothing in return. The letter was from her younger brother, Thomas, who had gone east to school in Philadelphia 2 years ago. It informed her that he had contracted tuberculosis and was not expected to recover. The doctors said it was only a matter of time, and Thomas had written to say goodbye, to tell her he loved her, and that she should not mourn him too long. She had read those words over and over throughout the day, had tried to continue with her chores and her responsibilities, but by evening the weight of it had crushed through her carefully maintained composure. Her father was in town, drinking away his own demons at the saloon, and she had been alone with her grief until Cole had appeared beside her like some kind of silent guardian. That night she lay in her bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to the coyotes sing in the hills, and she thought about the way Cole's arms had felt around her, strong and safe and utterly without expectation. She had known men who would have used her vulnerability as an opportunity, who would have pressed for details or offered empty platitudes. But Cole had simply given her what she needed most: his presence and his silence. She wondered what kind of life had taught him such compassion, what sorrows he carried in his own heart that made him understand her so well. Cole Bennett lay in his bunk in the long room where the ranch hands slept, his hands folded behind his head, his eyes open in the darkness. He had seen the devastation in Eliza's face, and had recognized it as the look of someone who has lost something precious and irreplaceable. He had worn that expression himself once, years ago, when his wife and infant son had died in childbirth, leaving him alone in a world that suddenly seemed too vast and empty to navigate. He had drifted after that, working ranches from Montana to New Mexico, never staying long enough to form attachments, never letting anyone close enough to hurt him again. But something about Silver Creek had made him pause, had made him consider the possibility of putting down roots, and something about Eliza Thornton had stirred feelings he thought had died with his family. The days that followed were marked by a new awareness between them. Eliza found her eyes seeking Cole out as he worked with the horses in the corral, his movements efficient and sure as he broke the young mustangs to saddle. She watched the way he spoke quietly to the animals, patient and firm, never cruel, and she saw the same gentleness that he had shown her that night on the porch. He caught her looking once and held her gaze for a long moment before nodding and returning to his work, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun. Cole found himself inventing reasons to be near the main house, volunteering for tasks that would bring him into contact with Eliza. He told himself he was just checking to make sure she was all right, that he was simply being a decent human being, but he knew the truth ran deeper than that. He liked the sound of her laugh when one of the younger hands told a joke at dinner. He liked the way she moved through the world with a quiet strength that reminded him of the desert plants that bloomed after rain, resilient and beautiful against all odds. He liked the small smile she gave him now when their paths crossed, a smile that seemed meant just for him. 3 weeks after that night on the porch, Eliza received another letter. This one was from her brother's landlady in Philadelphia, informing her that Thomas had passed away peacefully in his sleep. She read it standing in the ranch office, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty windows, and she felt her vision narrow and darken at the edges. She walked outside on unsteady legs, not knowing where she was going, only knowing she needed air and space and something solid to hold on to. She found herself in the barn, standing in the cool shadows between the stalls, her breath coming in short gasps as she tried to hold back the tears. Cole was in the tack room, oiling saddles, when he heard the sound of someone struggling to breathe. He set down the rag and leather oil and walked quickly toward the sound, finding Eliza leaning against a post, her hand pressed to her chest, her face pale. He did not hesitate. He crossed the space between them and pulled her into his arms, and she went willingly, gratefully, pressing her face against his chest once more and letting the tears come. This time he did stroke her hair, his calloused hand gentle against the soft strands, and he murmured wordless sounds of comfort that seemed to come from someplace deep and instinctive. "He's gone," she whispered against his shirt, the first words she had spoken about her loss. "My brother." "He's gone." "I know," Cole said softly, though he had not known the specifics until that moment. "I'm sorry." She cried harder at his simple acknowledgement, at the lack of false comfort or empty promises that everything would be all right. He just held her and let her grieve, and when at last she quieted, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief and handed it to her. She took it and wiped her face, then looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. "You must think I am so weak," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "No," he said firmly. "I think you are one of the strongest people I have ever met, strong enough to feel things deeply. That takes more courage than most folks have." She stared at him, this quiet cowboy who seemed to see straight into her soul, and she felt something shift and settle in her heart, something that felt like recognition and homecoming all at once. "How do you know exactly what I need?" she asked. A shadow crossed his face, old pain that he carried like a scar. "I have been where you are," he said simply. "Lost someone who mattered. I know what it feels like when the world keeps spinning and you are standing still." "Who did you lose?" she asked softly, bold in her own grief. "My wife," he said, the words coming slowly as if he was pulling them from somewhere deep and seldom visited. "And my son." He never took a breath. She followed him a few hours later. That was 7 years ago. Eliza's hand came up to cover her mouth, her eyes filling with fresh tears, these ones for him. "Cole, I am so sorry," he shook his head. "I am not telling you to make you sad. I am telling you so you know that I understand, and so you know that it does get easier to carry, not lighter but easier. You learn how to hold it." She nodded, understanding in a way she had not before why his presence brought her such comfort. He was not untouched by loss. He knew its weight and its shape, and he had survived it. "Will you tell me about them?" she asked. "Sometime." "Sometime," he agreed, and the promise hung between them like a thread connecting their two wounded hearts. In the weeks that followed, they began to spend more time together. It started innocently enough, with Cole finding Eliza in the garden one evening and helping her pull weeds until the light faded. Then she sought him out in the stable to ask his opinion on which horses would be best for the fall roundup, though they both knew she had been making such decisions competently for years. They took to sitting on the porch after dinner, watching the stars emerge in the vast desert sky, talking about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up on a farm in Missouri, about learning to rope and ride from his father, about the restlessness that had driven him west after his family died. She told him about her childhood on the ranch, about her mother's love of music and books, about her fear that her father was drinking himself to death, and she was powerless to stop it. One night, nearly 2 months after Thomas's death, Eliza turned to Cole and said, "That first night when I was crying on the porch, you did not ask me what was wrong." "Why?" Cole was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. "Figured you would tell me if you wanted me to know." "Figured what you needed right then was not questions but a place to put your pain for a little while." "You were right," she said softly. "If you had asked, I would have had to find words, and I did not have any words. I just had this enormous hurt, and you let me give it to you without demanding anything in return." She paused, gathering courage. "I think that was when I started to fall in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, and Cole turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face in the moonlight. "Eliza," he said, and her name in his deep voice made her shiver. "I am a man with nothing to offer you but a saddle and a horse and a past full of ghosts." "That is not true," she said firmly. "You have a good heart and strong hands and the kind of kindness that cannot be taught. That is more than most men can claim." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I have been trying not to fall in love with you," he admitted. "Telling myself I am too old, too broken, that I would only bring you more sorrow. But the truth is I have been in love with you since the night you cried into my shirt and trusted me to hold you together." She smiled then, a real smile that reached her eyes, the first he had seen since her brother's death. "Then stop trying not to," she said. "Just let yourself feel it." He leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she met him halfway, and when his lips touched hers it was gentle and reverent, a kiss that tasted of promise and possibility. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his hand cupping her cheek. "I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you," he whispered. "You already are," she whispered back. Their courtship after that was conducted in the quiet moments stolen between work and duty. Cole would leave wildflowers on her windowsill, bright yellow and purple blooms that somehow survived in the harsh desert soil. Eliza would pack extra food in his lunch, little treats like the sugar cookies she knew he favored. They rode out together on Sundays, exploring the canyons and mesas that surrounded the ranch, and in those wide-open spaces they talked about their dreams and fears, building a foundation of trust and understanding. Eliza's father, Robert Thornton, noticed the change in his daughter, saw the light that had returned to her eyes, and when he realized the source was Cole Bennett, he called the foreman into his office one afternoon. Cole stood before the desk, his hat in his hands, while the older man studied him with sharp eyes that missed nothing despite the liquor he consumed. "You have feelings for my daughter," Robert said bluntly. "Yes, sir, I do," Cole replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "She has had enough pain in her life," Robert continued. "Lost her mother, lost her brother, has to watch her father pickling himself in whiskey." He paused, and something like shame flickered across his weathered face. "She deserves better than heartbreak, she does," Cole agreed. "And I aim to spend my life making sure she does not suffer another moment of it if I can help it." Robert leaned back in his chair, considering. "You are a good worker, Bennett, best foreman I have had. You treat the men fairly and the stock with care. But more than that, you treat my daughter with respect. I see the way you look at her, like she is something precious." He cleared his throat roughly. "That is the way a man should look at the woman he loves." Cole waited, his heart pounding, sensing the older man had more to say. "If you are serious about her, then you have my blessing," Robert said finally. "But I am telling you now, you hurt her, and I will make you regret it." "Understood, sir," Cole said, "but I will not hurt her. I would sooner cut off my own arm." Robert nodded, satisfied, and Cole left the office feeling lighter than he had in years. That evening he asked Eliza to take a walk with him, and they strolled out past the corrals to a spot where the land rose slightly, offering a view of the entire ranch spread out below them. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of orange and pink, and Cole turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Eliza Thornton," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I know I am not what you might have dreamed of when you imagined your future. I am older than you, and I have scars, and sometimes I wake up in the night reaching for ghosts. But I love you with everything I have in me, and I will work every day to build a life worthy of you. Will you marry me?" Eliza felt tears spring to her eyes, but these were tears of joy, of relief, of coming home after a long journey. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, Cole, I will marry you." He pulled her into his arms and kissed her deeply, pouring into it all the love and longing he had held back, and she kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms winding around his neck. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she laughed and pressed her face against his chest, right over his heart. "I love you," she said. "I love your kindness and your strength and the way you let me be sad when I needed to be sad. I love that you did not try to fix me, you just held me while I found my own way through." "I love you," he said against her hair. "I love your courage and your compassion and the way you see the good in people even when they cannot see it in themselves. You brought me back to life, Eliza. I thought I was done living, just going through the motions, and then you cried into my shirt and I felt my heart start beating again." They stood there as the light faded, wrapped in each other's arms, and made plans for their future. They would be married in the fall after the roundup. They would build a small house on the edge of the ranch property, close enough to help run things but far enough to have their own space. They would fill it with love and laughter, and if they were blessed, children who would grow up knowing they were wanted and cherished. The news of their engagement spread quickly through the ranch, and the hands were genuinely happy for their foreman, who had earned their respect with his fair treatment and hard work. The cook made a special dinner to celebrate, and someone broke out a fiddle, and there was dancing and singing late into the night. Eliza danced with Cole under the stars, his arms strong around her waist, her head resting on his shoulder, and she felt a happiness so complete it was almost frightening in its intensity. The months leading up to the wedding were busy with preparations and work. The fall roundup was hard and dusty, with long days in the saddle and nights around the campfire, but Cole and Eliza worked side by side, and the hands learned to respect her not just as the boss's daughter but as a capable rancher in her own right. Cole taught her tricks he had learned over the years, better ways to cut cattle out of the herd, how to read the weather in the behavior of the animals. She taught him about the specific quirks of this land where the water sources were, which canyons offered the best grazing. In the evenings, when the work was done, they would slip away from the camp and find a quiet spot to sit together. Cole told her more about his first wife, Sarah, and his son, whom they had planned to name James. He spoke of the guilt he had carried, the irrational but persistent belief that he should have somehow been able to save them. Eliza listened without judgment, holding his hand, and when he was finished she told him that loss was not his fault, that sometimes terrible things happened and there was no one to blame. "Sarah would want you to be happy," she said softly. "She would want you to love again." "I think she would have liked you," Cole said, a small sad smile on his face. "She had your strength, your way of facing things head on." "I wish I could have known her," Eliza said, and she meant it. She felt no jealousy toward the woman who had held Cole's heart first, only gratitude that she had loved him and taught him how to love deeply. They were married on a crisp October afternoon in 1882 in the small church in Silver Creek, with the whole town in attendance. Eliza wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slimmer frame, and carried a bouquet of desert wildflowers that Cole had ridden out at dawn to gather. Cole wore a new suit that he had purchased in Tucson, and he stood at the altar with his hands clasped, his eyes never leaving Eliza's face as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm. When Robert placed her hand in Cole's, he whispered something to the younger man that made Cole nod solemnly. And then Eliza was standing before the man she loved, promising to honor and cherish him for all the days of her life. Cole's voice was steady as he made his vows, his blue eyes bright with emotion. "I promise to be your safe place," he said, adding words not in the traditional ceremony. "To hold you when you need holding, to stand beside you when you need strength, to love you through joy and sorrow, all the days we are given." Eliza felt tears slip down her cheeks as she made her own promises, her hand tight in his. "I promise to be your partner," she added. "To see you, all of you, the light and the shadows, and to love every part. To build a life with you that honors what we have lost and celebrates what we have found." When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Cole kissed her with a tenderness that made the assembled crowd sigh, and then they walked back down the aisle together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next as one. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed an army. There was music and dancing, and toasts that ranged from heartfelt to hilarious. Robert Thornton stood and raised his glass, his voice only slightly slurred, and said, "To my daughter, who is the best thing I ever had a hand in creating, and to Cole Bennett, who is the best man I know. May you have a long and happy life together, and may you be kinder to each other than this world has been to either of you." It was not a polished speech, but it came from the heart, and Eliza crossed to her father and hugged him tightly, whispering, "I love you, Papa. Please take care of yourself." "I will try," he said, and she had to be content with that. As the sun set and the party continued, Cole swept Eliza up in his arms and carried her toward the small house they had built, accompanied by cheers and catcalls from the ranch hands. He kicked the door shut behind them and set her gently on her feet, and for a moment they just stood there, looking at each other in the soft glow of the lamps Eliza had lit earlier. "Hello, wife," Cole said, his voice low and warm. "Hello, husband," Eliza replied, smiling up at him. He reached up and carefully removed the pins from her hair, letting it fall in waves around her shoulders, and then he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her slowly, deeply, taking his time. She responded with equal passion, her fingers working at the buttons of his shirt, and they undressed each other with a mixture of eagerness and reverence, exploring the new intimacy of marriage. Cole was gentle and patient, mindful of her inexperience, and when they finally came together, it was with a sense of rightness that left them both breathless and amazed. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, Eliza's head on Cole's chest, his arm around her shoulders, and talked quietly about nothing and everything until sleep claimed them both. It was the first night of their new life together, and it set the pattern for all the nights to come. Honest communication, physical affection, and the deep comfort of knowing they were loved completely. The first year of their marriage was one of adjustment and discovery. They learned each other's rhythms and quirks, the small domestic details that make up a shared life. Eliza discovered that Cole was an early riser who liked to watch the sunrise with a cup of strong coffee. Cole learned that Eliza sang to herself when she cooked, old songs her mother had taught her, and that the sound of it made his heart ache with happiness. They worked the ranch together, a true partnership, and under their joint management Silver Creek prospered. Robert Thornton, true to his word to his daughter, began to drink less. It was not an easy change and there were setbacks, but with Cole's steady presence and Eliza's unwavering support, he slowly began to reclaim his life. He spent more time working the ranch again, riding out with the hands, making decisions about stock and grazing rights. Cole never tried to usurp his authority, always deferred to him as the owner, but Robert increasingly relied on his son-in-law's judgment and experience. One evening, about 8 months after the wedding, Robert joined Cole and Eliza on their porch, accepting the cup of coffee Eliza offered. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the stars emerge, and then Robert said, "I want to thank you both for not giving up on me. For pulling me back from the edge. You are family, Papa," Eliza said simply. "We do not give up on family." Robert nodded, his throat working. "I want you to know, Cole, that I am planning to make you a partner in the ranch, equal shares, you and Eliza. This place will be yours when I am gone, but I see no reason to wait. You have earned it." Cole was stunned. "Sir, that is incredibly generous, but I do not need—" "I know you do not need it," Robert interrupted. "That is why I am offering it. You are not here for what you can get. You are here because you love my daughter and you love this land. That makes you the right person to help steward it into the future." Cole looked at Eliza, who was smiling through tears, and then back at Robert. "I accept," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise you I will treat this place with the care and respect it deserves." They shook hands, sealing the agreement, and that night Cole held Eliza close and marveled at the strange turns life could take. 7 years ago he had been a broken man drifting through the world without purpose. And now he had a wife he adored, a home, a partnership in a thriving ranch, and a father-in-law who had become a true friend. The seasons turned, bringing the cold of winter and the heat of summer, and through it all Cole and Eliza's love deepened and matured. They had their disagreements, of course, moments of frustration and misunderstanding, but they had learned from the start to talk things through, to be honest even when it was uncomfortable. The foundation they had built that night on the porch, when he held her without asking why and she trusted him with her grief, proved strong enough to weather any storm. In the spring of 1884, Eliza discovered she was pregnant. She told Cole one evening as they sat together after dinner, suddenly nervous despite the fact that they had talked about wanting children. "I am going to have a baby," she said simply, watching his face. Cole's eyes went wide and a dozen emotions flickered across his features: joy, fear, hope, and a shadow of old pain. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, his face buried in her hair. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice muffled. "As certain as I can be," she said. "The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "I am terrified," he admitted. "After what happened with Sarah, I know," she said, covering his hands with hers. "I know you are scared. But I am healthy and strong, and Dr. Harrison says there is no reason to think anything will go wrong. We will face this together, Cole. Whatever happens, we will face it together." He nodded, swallowing hard, and then a slow smile spread across his face. "We are going to have a baby," he said, as if testing the words. "We are," she confirmed, smiling back at him. He let out a whoop of joy and picked her up, spinning her around carefully before setting her back on her feet and kissing her soundly. "I love you," he said. "I love you so much." The pregnancy progressed without complication, though Cole hovered nervously, trying not to let his fear show. Eliza was patient with him, understanding the source of his anxiety, and she made sure to keep him informed of every development, every kick and flutter. She let him feel the baby move, his large hand spread across her swelling belly, and she saw the wonder in his eyes that pushed back the shadows of his past. Robert was delighted at the prospect of becoming a grandfather, and he threw himself into preparing for the baby's arrival with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone. He built a beautiful cradle from oak, sanding it until it was smooth as silk, and he carved horses and cattle into the headboard with surprising skill. "Your mother would have loved this," he told Eliza as he presented it to her, and she hugged him tightly, grateful for his presence in her life. In December of 1884, on a cold, clear night when the stars seemed close enough to touch, Eliza went into labor. Cole sent one of the hands racing for the doctor, and then did his best to stay calm and supportive as his wife worked through the contractions. It was a long labor, lasting through the night and into the next day, and there were moments when Cole's fear threatened to overwhelm him, when he saw Sarah's pale face instead of Eliza's flushed and determined one. But Eliza was strong, stronger than he had ever imagined, and with Dr. Harrison's guidance and Cole's hand gripping hers, she brought their son into the world in the late afternoon, his lusty cry announcing his arrival. Cole stared at the small, red-faced baby in wonder, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. The doctor placed the infant in Eliza's arms, and she looked up at Cole with exhausted triumph. "He is perfect," she whispered. "You are perfect," Cole managed, leaning down to kiss her forehead, then the baby's soft head. "Both of you." They named him Thomas Robert Bennett, honoring the brother Eliza had lost and the father who had found his way back to them. Little Tommy was a healthy, hungry baby who kept them up at night with his demands but filled their days with joy. Cole was a devoted father, getting up for midnight feedings, walking the floor with his son when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint. He had been robbed of this experience once, and he was determined to savor every moment of it now. Watching Cole with their son, seeing the tenderness with which he held the tiny boy, the wonder in his eyes as Tommy gripped his finger with surprising strength, Eliza fell in love with her husband all over again. He had given her comfort when she needed it most, had loved her through her grief, and now he was giving their son the same steady, patient care. She understood, perhaps for the first time fully, what a gift she had been given that night on the porch when Cole had simply held her and asked no questions. As Tommy grew from infant to toddler, the Bennett family flourished. The ranch continued to thrive under the joint management of Cole, Eliza, and Robert. They expanded their herd, improved their breeding stock, and gained a reputation for fair dealing that brought them business from all over the territory. Cole hired more hands as they grew, and he treated them with the same respect he had always shown, creating a loyal crew who would have followed him anywhere. In 1886, Eliza became pregnant again, and this time Cole's fear was tempered by the memory of Tommy's successful birth. Their daughter, whom they named Sarah Grace, arrived in the spring, a tiny girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's blue eyes. Cole wept when he held her for the first time, and Eliza knew he was thinking of the son he had lost, the wife who had never gotten to hold their baby, but she also saw the joy in his face, the gratitude for this second chance. Robert Thornton lived to see both his grandchildren grow, to teach Tommy to ride and to bounce Sarah on his knee. He remained sober more often than not, and though he still had his struggles, he had found purpose again in family. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1889, he died knowing that the ranch he had built with his own hands would continue in capable and loving care. Cole and Eliza grieved his loss together, as they had learned to grieve all losses with honesty and support. They told their children stories about their grandfather, keeping his memory alive, and they continued to run Silver Creek with the values he had instilled. The ranch became known not just for its fine cattle, but for the way the owners treated both their animals and their employees with dignity and respect. Years passed, bringing both challenges and triumphs. There were droughts that tested their resources, cold winters that took their toll on the herd, market fluctuations that required careful management. But through it all, Cole and Eliza faced each obstacle as partners, their love and respect for each other never wavering. They added 2 more children to their family, another boy and another girl, and their house was filled with the noise and chaos and joy of a growing family. On quiet evenings when the children were in bed and the work was done, Cole and Eliza would sit on their porch, the same porch where she had first cried into his shirt, and they would hold hands and watch the stars. Sometimes they talked about the day's events, the plans for tomorrow, the dreams for their children's futures. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, simply being present with each other, the way Cole had been present for Eliza all those years ago. You remember that night. Eliza asked one evening, her head resting on Cole's shoulder. "When I was crying and you just held me." "I remember," Cole said softly. "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever met to let yourself be that vulnerable." "I remember thinking you were the kindest person I had ever met," Eliza said. "You gave me exactly what I needed without me having to ask for it. You have been doing that ever since." Cole turned to look at her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek in the gesture that had become so familiar over the years. "You saved me, Eliza. I was just existing before I met you, going through the motions. You brought me back to life." "We saved each other," she said, turning her face to kiss his palm. "That is what love does. It saves us from ourselves, from our loneliness, from the belief that we have to carry everything alone." They kissed then, a slow, sweet kiss that tasted of coffee and contentment. And when they broke apart, they sat together watching the stars until the night grew cold and they went inside to their warm bed and the life they had built together. Tommy grew up to be a fine rancher, learning the business from his father and eventually taking over much of the day-to-day management of Silver Creek. He married a schoolteacher from Tucson, a smart woman named Catherine who fit seamlessly into the family. Sarah became a teacher herself, opening a small school on the ranch for the children of the hands and the neighboring homesteaders. Their younger siblings found their own paths, one becoming a veterinarian and the other a skilled horse trainer. Cole and Eliza became grandparents and then great-grandparents, and they watched with pride and gratitude as their family grew and flourished across the Arizona territory. They had started with grief and loss, with tears shed into a cotton shirt on a dusty porch, but they had built something lasting and beautiful from that foundation of honesty and compassion. In 1912, when Cole was 62 and Eliza was 54, they took a trip back to that same porch where their love story had begun. It was early evening, the lights soft and golden, and they sat in the rocking chairs that had replaced the simple bench of 30 years ago. Cole reached over and took Eliza's hand, his thumb rubbing over her knuckles in the familiar gesture. "I have been thinking," he said, "about that night, about how I almost walked past you, thought maybe you wanted to be alone with whatever was troubling you. What made you stop?" Eliza asked, curious after all these years. "Something in the way you were standing," Cole said thoughtfully. "Like you were holding yourself together by sheer force of will, and one more thing, one more question or expectation would shatter you completely. I knew that feeling. I knew what it was like to need someone to just be there without demanding anything. I am so grateful you stopped," Eliza said, her voice thick with emotion despite the passage of time. "I am so grateful you knew what I needed before I did. I am grateful you let me," Cole said. "That you trusted me with your pain. That was a gift, Eliza. You gave me the chance to be useful again, to matter to someone." They sat there as the sun set, painting the sky in the same shades of copper and gold that it had 30 years ago, and they marveled at the life they had created from that moment of simple kindness. 4 children, all of them healthy and happy and successful in their own ways. A ranch that had grown and prospered and would continue for generations. A love that had weathered every storm and emerged stronger each time. If you could go back, Eliza asked softly, knowing everything that would happen, all the good and the hard, would you still stop? Cole did not hesitate. Every single time, he said. I would stop every single time and hold you for as long as you needed. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Eliza Bennett. You and our children and this life we built together. You are my home, Eliza said, the words she had said 1,000 times before but never lost their meaning. You have been my home since that night, and you will be my home for all the nights to come. They kissed as the first stars appeared, 2 people who had found each other in the midst of loss and built something extraordinary. The ranch continued around them, the daily rhythm of life that they had nurtured and protected, and they knew that whatever time they had left would be spent exactly like this. Together, grateful, deeply and irrevocably in love. The years that followed were gentle ones. Cole and Eliza gradually stepped back from the daily management of the ranch, content to let Tommy and his siblings take the reins while they enjoyed their grandchildren and the quiet pleasures of a life well lived. They took long rides together through the canyons they had explored as newlyweds, their bodies older but their spirits still young. They sat on their porch in the evenings, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, always connected. In 1918, Cole woke one morning feeling strange, a heaviness in his chest that he could not quite name. He said nothing to Eliza, not wanting to worry her, but she knew him too well to miss the signs. She called for the doctor, who examined Cole and delivered the news they had both been dreading. His heart was failing. There was no treatment, no cure, just the inevitable march of time taking its toll. Cole took the news calmly, holding Eliza's hand as the doctor left. I am not afraid, he told her. I have had more happiness in the years with you than most men get in 10 lifetimes. I am ready. I am not ready to lose you, Eliza said, her voice breaking. I know, Cole said gently, pulling her into his arms, but you are the strongest person I know. You will be all right. Our children will take care of you, and you will take care of them, and you will tell our grandchildren stories about the old cowboy who loved their grandmother more than anything in the world. They spent Cole's final weeks surrounded by family, with children and grandchildren coming to say goodbye, to hear his stories one more time, to thank him for the example he had set. Tommy sat with his father and talked about the ranch, receiving final pieces of advice. Sarah brought her students to sing for him. The younger children shared their own family's milestones, wanting him to know how his influence had shaped their lives. Through it all, Eliza was by his side, holding his hand, reading to him, simply being present the way he had been present for her so many years ago. On a warm evening in late June, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Cole squeezed Eliza's hand one last time and smiled at her. Thank you, he whispered, for letting me love you. Thank you for knowing how, she whispered back, tears streaming down her face. He closed his eyes then, his hand still in hers, and slipped away as peacefully as a man could hope for, surrounded by love and secure in the knowledge that he had lived well and been loved deeply. Eliza mourned him with the same honest emotion that he had always respected in her. She cried into the pillow that still smelled like him, wore his shirts around the house for comfort, and talked to him as if he could still hear her. Her children worried about her, but she assured them she was all right, that grief was not something to be avoided but to be moved through, and that she knew how to carry loss. Cole had taught her, after all, that night on the porch when he held her without asking why. She lived another 12 years, watching her family continue to grow, seeing Silver Creek thrive under Tommy's management, knowing that the legacy she and Cole had built together would endure. She never remarried, never even considered it. Cole had been her great love, her partner, her home, and she needed no one else to complete her story. On a spring evening in 1930, at the age of 72, Eliza sat on her porch one last time, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and she told them the story of how their grandfather had let her cry into his shirt without asking why, and how that simple act of compassion had changed everything. She told them that love was not always grand gestures and passionate declarations, but sometimes it was just knowing what someone needed and giving it to them without expectation of return. She told them to look for partners who would hold them through the storms, who would see them at their worst and love them anyway, who would be present in the small, quiet moments that make up a life. That night, she went to sleep in the bed she had shared with Cole for so many years, and she dreamed of him waiting for her on a porch under endless stars, his arms open, his smile warm and welcoming. When her children found her the next morning, she was gone, a peaceful expression on her face, and they knew she had found him again. They buried her next to Cole on a hillside overlooking Silver Creek, with a view of the mountains and the endless sky. The headstone they erected was simple, bearing both their names and a single line that Eliza had requested. They saved each other. And beneath it, the years that marked their journey. Cole 1850 to 1918, Eliza 1858 to 1930, together forever. The ranch continued for generations after them, run by their descendants who carried forward the values of hard work, compassion, and integrity that Cole and Eliza had instilled. The story of how they met, how a cowboy had let a grieving woman cry into his shirt without asking why, became family legend, told and retold to each new generation as an example of what real love looked like. Not perfect, not without pain, but honest and true, and built on a foundation of seeing each other fully and choosing to stay anyway. And on quiet evenings when the work was done, and the family gathered on the porch that had witnessed the beginning of it all, they could almost feel the presence of Cole and Eliza, still there in spirit, still holding each other, still showing by example that the greatest gift we can give another person is our presence in their pain, our steadiness in their storm, and our unwavering commitment to love them through whatever comes. That was the legacy they left, more valuable than land or cattle or gold. The knowledge that love, real love, starts with something as simple as being there when someone needs you, and asking nothing in return except the privilege of standing beside them in their darkest moments and their brightest days alike.